Hello everybody. This tutorial is going to show you how to use the show management library in a scene. It will not cover the tools or process for how to produce a show. That will be made available in a separate tutorial linked in the description below. If you would like to know how the show management library works, that is also in a separate tutorial and will be available in the links below. Let's head over to the awesome repository where the show management example scene can be found. You may want to take a look at the show management library documentation. In here, it will cover how to implement the show manager library into your scene. This tutorial will be going over much of this. Let's dive in. As we take a look at the show setup, we see the first thing that we create is a show manager. In the previous tutorial that explains how the show manager library works, we learned that the show manager does all the heavy lifting of managing the video texture, figuring out where the video is in its current offset, working with the subtitles to then notify the action manager for which actions are valid in that current time offset, and firing them accordingly. To create a show manager, you must pass it your show schedule data, which can be found in the schedule setup. Here you will see it defines a default show, which will be the intermission show playing when no actual show is active. And down here listing each show that it wants to have. You will notice that each show has a unique ID, a title, an artist, a link to the video, the subtitle file, which contains the SRT format, the time at which it should start, this is in seconds and in UTC, and the length of the video. You may also notice that up here, so that I do not have to wait for the show to start in real time, like for when you're actually publishing this, I take the current time plus 5 seconds and then have to divide it by 1,000 to get back into seconds. I do the same thing for the second and third show, but adding enough time between each so that they play roughly 5 seconds apart. Back to the show setup, you'll next see that the show manager registers to several events, such as when the show is stopped, a specific show is played, and if the video status changes. Use cases for which you'd want to do this would be when you want to trigger events such as hide the artist's name. In this case, the artist name is up there. Or when you start playing a video, you will want to update what's going on, for example, showing the artist that's about to be played, and maybe even capturing the video texture that's about to be played and applying it to your textures. So you can see here that the event provides us access to the video texture that it created, and from there we can then attach it to materials that are in the scene. Without this, if I was to comment this out, we would have no video visible on the scene. Also, you can notice it's updating the artist's name. I would like to point out this pattern of registering to listeners and getting callbacks is the core of how the show management library works. It tries not to be biased and doesn't pretend to know or want to influence how a scene show is going to go, nor could it know. Are you going to have 1 video screen, 2 video screens, 10? It can't know. So it's providing callbacks with enough information for you to integrate it into your scene. The next thing that you may want to configure is adding your own action handlers. The show manager comes with several action handlers already, such as setting beats per minute, announce, animate, pause, stop all. Here's an example of how you could define your own. In the tutorial that explains how the show management library works, it goes into great detail on how these show action handlers work. I will try to provide a high-level explanation of this now. A show action handler will define itself with a name and then implement several possible methods. There's a matches method, which will tell the show action manager if this handler can handle the provided action. If matches is true, it will process the action. Decode action provides a method of parsing the action because it's going to be passed in as a string. And this would give you additional help for getting a structured set of values to make use of. This is optional, but it is very helpful. The decode action result is then passed to the process method. At this point, you now have a parsed action with a much easier structure to work with, and then you can perform whatever action you want. To go into a little more detail about the decode action, there is an out-of-the-box provided parse method from the library. Parse action with options is provided for you. You can implement your own, but this is kind of a basic beginning parser for anyone that wants to start off with something. The expected format is the name of the action and then delimited parameters based on with a space. So parameter 1, parameter 2, as many as you want. And then lastly, you can have a JSON object if you wanted to. The JSON object allows you to pass even more structured parameters should you choose. What gets returned is the action parameter object, which it contains in a string array of each parameter, and then params would be the even more structured version of such a thing. If you take a look at announce action handler, which is provided by the library, it defines its action parameter params as this, which when you look at this structure, it matches up exactly with our subtitles. So if we take a look at this defines text goes to text, duration goes to duration, and then it didn't define it here, but you could even pass a color and font size. The subtitle file is in the format of SRT, which is a subtitle format used for displaying text over videos. We instead, however, changed this and chose to instead implement it as a way to execute actions. An SRT format is as follows here. There is a block that represents one SRT queue, followed by the second and the third. There are time slices in here that tells you when this queue is valid, followed by the text. However, in our case, we're not using text, we're using actions. And here's an action, for example, that's going to be using an action handler that will handle. And for example here, announce is an action handler that's provided out of the box with JSON parameters that tell it how it should operate. For example, the text should be, welcome to our show, duration 3 seconds. I can restart the show, and you'll see it when this countdown is finished and the show starts. You can see more examples of provided action handlers such as animate, setting the beats per minute, defining stop all, and more. Returning to show setup, you can see you can also register your own action handlers. In this example, there is an action whose name is say, which will match if the sent in action is its name, followed by decoding the action and processing it, which will do a display announcement. The expected format it's looking for when it decodes is say, words, and then JSON file. Let's see if I can put this in the subtitle file and see if it works. There we go. You can see that additional configuration for action handlers is required. The pause action handler and the stop action handler you probably will need to override. That is because there is no way for the library to know what pause really means. It does provide a default implementation where it will attempt to pause animations, for example, by just calling stop. However, that doesn't always mean that's what's intended. Pausing the video might mean putting a this video is paused image over the video. Or same thing with stop. When you stop, you might want to stop one animation, but then play idle, for example. There's no way to predict all of the ways to do that. So overriding and implementing your own stop handler is a good way to allow you to do it the way that your show wants to. And lastly, there is an older way of implementing actions. This is not with action handlers. You can implement an extension run action method and pass in just action text and write the code however you want here. This is not as elegant of a solution because it requires you to toggle back and forth between the subtitles and the code more often, where if you were to write your subtitles with parameters, you can work more in your subtitle file without revisiting the code as much. Next is the run of show system. This system is what will allow the shows, the videos, to play at the correct time and after each other. Without this system, you still can manage a show, however, now it's up to you to invoke it directly. A special action handler I wanted to talk about specifically is the animation handler. The animation handler will animate entities in your scene. To do that, though, however, you must first register them with the action show manager. And this is how you do that. Here you can see we are creating show entity models, giving them a name, providing the GLTF shape, as well as information such as its idle animation name, if it should start visible or not, where it should be placed in the scene, and its rotation. From here, we then register them to the show manager, and the action handler will take it from there. Taking a look at the subtitle file, animate action handler syntax here is name of show entity followed by parameters. So this name should correlate to the name of an entity that you created. So we can see here we created an entity called speaker L1 and then registered it to the action manager, followed by some parameters. For example, play animation L1, loop it, and sync it to the BPM. The animation name is self-explanatory. This should be the name of an animation inside of the GLB that is linked to this entity. Loop means it should loop over and over again. And then sync BPM is the trickier one. This one is actually related to this other action handler, BPM 110. This is saying that the beats per minute is 110 beats per minute, and that the animation should be played at that rate. So if the BPM was to slow or go faster, the animation play rate will keep up with that if BPM sync is true. To demonstrate the BPM animation sync rate, we're going to pay really close attention to this speaker here. Right now the BPM is 110, and the speaker is pulsating at an appropriate rate. If I was to increase this number by, let's say, three times, this speaker should pulse much faster, because the video, well, in this case I made it change, but see how much faster this is pulsing? That is what I mean by BPM sync. Not all animations you will want that for, but in case you do, that's what that does. This lastly brings me to the debug panel, which can be found here. This attempts to make it a little easier to debug whether your actions are firing at the correct time or not, or it also allows you to replay your show from the beginning to view it multiple times without having to hot swap or reload the scene. So in this example here, I can see what's playing, intermission is on, and then the next show 2 is about to play. Now show 2 is playing. I can see for how long it's been playing. There's 3 times slices here. We have video elapsed time, the entire elapsed time that the system has been running. These are matching the same right now. I can pause it and see they're roughly the same. But if, for example, you come in the middle of a show, lapse time will be much smaller, but the offset will be higher because it needs to jump forward in time. And then lastly is this subtitle file. Again, these two numbers should be identical. or we have a problem with synchronization. Next is I can disable the run of show, meaning when this show ends, it won't try to run the next one or the next one. And I can skip around kind of like a playlist and make sure my shows are working correctly. I can also re-enable run of show and reset, which will restart all the shows. It'll increment all the shows 5 seconds forward relative to the time you click this, and it should run them in sequence. Next is these three numbers down here tells you the number of actions processed for this show, as well as if there were any errors. This is helpful, again, if you're working in your show. You might accidentally create some bad syntax or something. So if I don't close this quote, this should now be an error. So it's processing, but there's one error. This is helpful in case you're watching your show and want to know, hey, I didn't see an event or an action fire, and you're wondering why. At this point, this gets rather technical. You have to go into the developer tools and look for an error. And see if it reported it. So here we got it reporting an error. The error failed executing say words, and it doesn't give you much more information other than that's what went wrong, and you have to kind of troubleshoot it from there. There is additional log level controls. So this is kind of a lot being flooded into the logs. What we can do is we can change that. So at the top of the show setup here, we have a logger that the show management provides. We can change the default logging level. So right now it's at debug. We can turn this to info, for example. There's also one here for the animation set to tracing. Trace is the lowest level logging, meaning it'll spit out the most amount of information. Changing it to just be info, and I clear this, the amount of information should be much, much less. It will report errors and failures because those are more important than info. The hierarchy goes trace is the most fine-grained, debug is second, it goes error, warn, info, debug, trace. So if something is being logged at trace but your logging level is info, it won't log it. If it is an error, it'll log it because it's a higher priority. It's a way to reduce the amount of information in your logs. Looks like something's debugging. That's this logger here, which I can see is named right there. So I can choose to lower or raise different loggers to help me debug a particular problem. And that concludes this tutorial. Thank you for listening. If you wanted to get more into the weeds and understand more about how the Show Manager library works, there's another video out there that you can take a look at that goes into much more detail. Also, if you wanted to learn how to put it on a show, there will be a tutorial coming out for that as well. Thank you again, and happy building.